All right, back to our lessons through the Old Testament and in the period of the monarchy when Israel had kings. 3 kings ruled over all 12 tribes. The first of these was Saul. The second of these is David. This week we're going to cover David's reign, at least the beginning of it. And as we go through David, and it's going to be a couple of weeks, or a few weeks anyway, maybe a few years, I don't know. I want you to notice the difference between his emotions and Saul's emotions. Saul had 2 primary emotions. You never saw Saul mourn, or feel sorry for anybody. Saul pretty much got angry or he got afraid. And that's it. And you don't read that too much about David, maybe a couple times. But David wept a lot. David loved a lot. And David's heart went out to people. And David's heart went out to the Lord. So keep that in mind as we look at the difference between Saul and David. Now, David's transition period, as we looked at it last week, was David's time in Ziklag. And this week we start David's time in Hebron. David spends 7.5 years ruling as king primarily over one tribe, the tribe of Judah, in Hebron. But for the other 33 years, he rules over all 12 tribes of Israel in Jerusalem. Now, as we covered today, after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag, and on the 3rd day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothing torn and earth upon his head. The people have fled from the battle, and many of the people also have fallen, and they are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead, and David lamented with a lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son. Now, does anybody know what a lamentation is? It's a poem or a song that laments or mourns over loss. Lamentations, the book, is a lament or a sorrowful song over the death of a city, Jerusalem, because it has been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army. The song that David sings that is to be taught to Judah is a lamentation over King Saul and his son. Now, wait a minute. Why is he crying over Saul? Saul spent 7 years trying to kill this man. But David still loved Saul, and David loved Saul's son, Jonathan. Now, incidentally, back to that fellow that came and said, I killed King Saul. Didn't we read something different last week? Didn't we read that King Saul had actually just fallen on his own sword and committed suicide? Oh, that's what happened. This guy came and he lied to King David. It didn't do him any good. David killed him anyway, because he took him at his word. He says, if that's the testimony, then you're guilty of putting forth your hand against God's anointed. I, who have been promised to be the future king of Israel by God himself, refuse to put my hand against God's anointed, who is King Saul. Who in the world do you think you are that you can be guiltless if you do that? So David had him executed. Don't lie, folks. After this, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? You remember, he's living over in Ziklag, which at the time belonged to the Philistines. And the Lord said to him, go up. And David said, to which cities shall I go? And he said, to Hebron. So David went up there, he and his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. Now, wait a minute. What happened to Michal? Michal was Saul's daughter. Didn't David marry her? Isn't she David's wife? Well, if you remember, when David fled from Saul, Saul took David's wife as a way of getting him back and gave her to somebody else. And David, but I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to circle back to her in a few minutes. David brought up his men who were with him, everyone with his household, and they dwelt in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So David is king over just one tribe for about 7 years. Now Abner, does anybody remember who Abner was? He was the commander of Saul's army. Had taken Ishbosheth. Say that 10 times really fast. Had taken Ishbosheth. I'm afraid if I say it, I'm going to say a dirty word or something here. The son of Saul. Now, wait a minute. I thought Saul had 3 sons that died in the battle. Well, he did. So this is a 4th son. And he made him king. He brought him over to Mahanaim and made him king over Gilead and the Asherites and Jezreel and Ephraim and Benjamin and all of Israel. So who's the king over the rest of Israel? Ishbosheth. Abner made him king. Now, if Ishbosheth was a man of any stature or integrity or any strength at all, he would have been in the battle with Saul and his brothers. But he probably stayed out of the battle because he's a worthless fellow. And Abner, the general, is probably controlling this king from behind the scenes, telling him what to say and what to do. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned for 2 years. Now, but I thought there's a 7.5-year period here. Well, there is, and there's a couple of explanations. Either he was made king late in that 7.5-year period, or after the first 2 years, something significant may have happened. And the Bible is not really clear on this. But he does reign only 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Now let me show you where all this stuff is, because I want to get you thinking geographically. If you look right there in the center of the map, you see the tribal area of Benjamin. What tribe was King Saul from? He was from Benjamin, and therefore Ishbosheth is from Benjamin. Where was Saul's capital city? It was his hometown of Gibeah, which is in Benjamin. But Abner wisely takes Ishbosheth across the river over here to the west. You see where Gad is, the tribal area of Gad? Well, look just above that, and there's a little city there called Mahanaim. And why does he take him over there? Because Benjamin is right next to Judah. And he doesn't want Ishbosheth being assassinated, or if the two forces go to battle, Ishbosheth will die early. So he takes him over there. And Gibeon is also a city in Benjamin, so I want you to keep that in mind. Now look in the territory of Judah. You see just below the word Judah is the city Hebron. That's where David is ruling from. So now you got an idea in your head. So Abner, the son of Ner, I don't know if this is Big Abner or Little Abner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the sons of Saul, came out from Mahanaim over to Gibeon. So they crossed the Jordan River and they come into the territory of Benjamin. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and this is going to be important because Zeruiah is David's sister. And that makes Job David's nephew. And he's commanding David's army. And they all went out and they all met at the pool of Gibeon. I guess they're sunbathing. Anyway, they sat down, one army on one side of the pool and the other army on the other side of the pool. And Abner, one of the generals, says to Joab, "Let the young men arise and play before us." And Joab says, "Let them arise." What are they going to play, Monopoly? No. This means they get up and they do battle with one another, just a select group. And it's the young men. These are the new recruits, the people who have just been trained. These are not seasoned men in battle. So they got up and they crossed over by number, 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. And they each caught his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side, and 24 of them fall down dead. And battle erupts between these troops, and the battle was very fierce that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Now, if the other army is getting the best of you in those days, you don't just put your sword down and surrender. You run for your life. And this is what Abner and the rest of the people that are still alive are doing. So they take off. So the three sons of Zeruiah were there: Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. They're all David's nephews. And Asahel was as swift of foot as a wild gazelle. This man could run like the wind. And Asahel pursued Abner. Why? Because you can make a name for yourself. I killed the general of the enemy's army. So he's pursuing Abner. And as he went, he turned neither to the left hand nor to the right from following Abner. And Abner looked behind him. And this is one of the dynamics of civil war, people. And for those of you who have read anything about our own civil war, some of the people who are on the other side, north and south, are people that you know and people that you love. And these guys have been fighting together for years. They all know each other, and now they're on different sides. So Abner looks behind him as he's running away, and he says, "Is that you, Asahel?" Asahel answered, "Yup, it is I." And Abner said to him, Turn aside to your right hand or to your left, and seize one of the younger guys and take his spoil." But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. Now I want to make it clear right now that Abner is not afraid of Asahel. He wants to spare Asahel's life, and he's going to explain why. Abner said again to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground?" In other words, if you catch up with me, I'm going to have to kill you. "How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab?" Joab is the general of David's army. And Abner still has feelings for Joab and doesn't want this to happen. And he knows that this civil war is only going to be temporary. But Asahel refused to turn aside, and therefore Abner takes his spear and struck him in the belly with the butt of his spear, so that the spear came out Asahel's back. I guess that would do the trick. And he fell down there and he died where he was. And all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died, they just stood there. But Joab and Abishai kept pursuing Abner. And finally Abner gets up on a hill and he yells back at Joab, "Is this going to go on forever? You know, us destroying one another?" And Joab called off the pursuit. But he and Abishai did not forget what Abner had done to their little brother Asahel. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. So there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. There's two reasons for this. Ishbosheth is a weak leader. Secondly, God wants David to be ruler over all Israel. So the house of David has got to come stronger. And Saul had a concubine. That's not a female porcupine, but it's a girlfriend type of wife that you kind of take care of. You're not really fully married to her, and she's for the purpose of sexual gratification or for having children. And Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth says to his general, Abner, "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" Now, in that culture, that's not just a sexual thing. It's not, I want to have sex with you. What it is, if you go into your master's concubine or wife, that means you are saying, I am stronger than my master, and I want his position. And this is what Ishbosheth is accusing Abner of betraying him, wanting to be king instead of him. Now, I don't think that, some commentators think that Abner actually had done this. I don't think so, and I'm going to explain why to you in just a second. Abner was very angry over the words of Ishbosheth and said, "Am I a dog's head of Judah?" In other words, am I somebody from the side of the enemy, the tribe of Judah? This day I keep showing loyalty to the house of Saul your father, and to his brothers, and to his friends, and have not given you, Ishbosheth, into the hand of David. And yet this day you are charging me with a fault concerning a woman? Will God do so to Abner, and more also, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the house or the throne of David over Israel, over Judah, from Dan to Beersheba. That was the northern and southern borders of the entire nation of Israel. Now, if Abner had wanted Ishbosheth's throne to be king in his place, why would he respond by saying, "No, I'm going to set David up as king over all Israel"? So I don't think that he had violated Ishbosheth's concubine. But there's something else I want you to notice about these verses. Do you remember as we went through David's fleeing from Saul, I pointed out to you as much as I was able all of the people who knew that God had promised to David that he was going to be the next king of Israel. Saul knew. He even said it to David. Jonathan, his son, knew, and he said it to David. Abigail said it to David before her husband died. The Philistines, the enemies of Israel, even knew that the Lord had promised that David was going to be on the throne over all Israel. And here we find out that Abner knew that Yahweh had promised that David was going to be the next king. If you knew that David was going to be the next king, why in the world would you put somebody like Ishbosheth on the throne? Why in the world would you command an army that gets in the way and slows down the Lord's progress for putting David on the throne over all Israel? That makes absolutely no sense to me. But what we're going to discover this week is that blood is thicker than a spirit. Here we say in Alabama, blood is thicker than water. Do you know who Abner is? Abner was King Saul's uncle. And therefore, he's Ishbosheth's great uncle. Family, man. He's choosing family over the Lord. That's bad. That's bad. Folks, when your emotions take over and you refuse to follow the Lord in something he has made clear in his word, because you want to keep a good relationship with a family member, then you are not seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness, and you will not be blessed because of it. Now, Abner is about to do something really good, but it's going to cost him dearly because he did not put the Lord first. So Abner sent messengers to David at Hebron, saying, "To whom does the land belong?" In other words, to whom has God promised this land? "Make your covenant with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you to bring over all of Israel to you," because Abner had a lot of influence in the rest of the tribes. Now, what kind of covenant would David make with him? David could have said, "Hey, God's already promised me this. Why do I need to make a deal with you?" Well, the deal is, as most commentators think, is that David is willing to make Abner the general over all of Israel in place of Joab, if Abner will bring the rest of the tribes in under David's kingship. That's the deal. You can imagine how Joab is going to respond to this. First of all, Abner killed my brother, and I don't want him taking my place. And so, King David said, "Good, I will make a covenant with you, but one thing I require of you, that is, you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face." You remember I said we'd be coming back to Michal, David's first wife. Because in David's eyes and in the king's eyes in those days, if somebody takes your wife, that means you ain't worthy to be king. So he's getting her back. That's important to him. So David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, "Give me my wife, Michal, whom I betrothed," or paid the purchase price of 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband Palti, or in here, this passage, Paltiel, the son of Laish. But her husband went with her, weeping after her all the way to Bahurim. And Abner finally looked at him and said, "Go, return." And he returned. Folks, I think that is just about the saddest verse in Samuel. This guy has been married to this woman now for probably 14 years. David has not seen her. He's been enjoying life with this woman, and now she is taken away from him. So Abner conferred with the elders of Israel, saying, "For some time past you have been seeking David as king over you." Now, isn't that something? There's a lot of dynamics in here that seem contradictory and complicated. I mean, the rest of the tribes are at war with Judah. They fight. They have skirmishes. They have battles. And yet, Abner reveals, as he gathers all the elders together, you guys have been thinking about this for a while. And there's a good number of reasons that they've been thinking about it. First of all, everybody knows that Yahweh has promised that David is going to rule over all Israel. Everybody knows that. So this is in the back of the elders' minds. Secondly, Ishbosheth is a weak leader. And the house of Ishbosheth, Saul's son, is getting weaker and weaker. And the third thing is, these elders can't look back and say, David has done us wrong in anything. David has always dealt well with all of Israel, and he's made a good name for himself among them. So now Abner continues, "Bring it about, for the Lord has promised David." He reminds them of this promise, saying, "By the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies." So Abner also spoke to Benjamin. Now, Benjamin's one of the tribes. How come they're singled out for special mention? Because Benjamin is the smallest and the weakest of the tribes, but they can say, hey, our guy's on the throne. And so Abner has to go and convince them. Does he succeed? He not only succeeds, he succeeds overwhelmingly. It says, and then Abner went to tell David at Hebron all that Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. That means nobody in Benjamin objected to saying, let's get rid of Ishbosheth and crown David king over the whole house of Israel. So it's unanimous, folks. And Abner came with 20 men to David at Hebron to make the deal. And David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. And Abner said to David, I'm going to get up and go, and I'm going to gather all of Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and so that you may reign over all that your heart desires. And David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. That's not the end of the story. And Joab shows up in Hebron and says, what in the world have you done? Behold, Abner came to you. Why is it that you send him away so that he's gone? You know that Abner, the son of Ner, came to deceive you, and to know you're going out and you're coming in, and to know all that you're doing. He wants to know all your plans. When Joab came out from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought Abner back from the well at Sirah. But David did not know about this. And when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the middle of the gate to speak with him privately, and there he struck him in the belly so that he died for the blood of Asahel, his brother. So Joab was wrong, and Abner died doing a good thing, which he should have done 7 years before. But he chose his own family over the Lord. And David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and mourn before Abner. Now that must have been very humiliating for Joab. And King David followed the funeral bier, and they buried Abner at Hebron. And the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king lamented for Abner, saying, should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. Publicly, David calls his nephew Joab wicked for slaying Abner. And all the people wept over Abner again. And then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was still day. And David swore, saying, God, do so to me, and more also, if I taste bread or anything else until the sun sets. And all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them, as everything that the king did pleased all the people. David is popular among all Israel. Even with the death of Abner, all the tribes understood that it was not David's will to put Abner, the son of Ner, to death. So he's enjoying great popularity. And the king answered, or said to his servants, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And then he's not saying this to all Israel, just to his servants. Look at this next line. And I am this day weak, though anointed king, because these sons of Zeruiah, my sister, are too harsh for me. The Lord requite the evildoer according to his wickedness. Folks, David is the king. If your general does something bad, what do? you have to address it. But David confesses to his servants, I'm not going to address this issue. They're just too harsh for me. And they are family. So David honors their sin and his kin over the Lord. Do you remember what cost Eli, the prophet, the priest, his life? God said to Eli, you have esteemed your sons above me, and you have let them continue in their sinfulness. And it cost all of them their lives. Don't choose family over the Lord. What do you do when you notice bad behavior? Well, I mean, you got to, let's just take the example of somebody that I've known. He's got a son who becomes a drunk when he's 14 years old. You know? I mean, what kid doesn't rebel to one degree or another? And you can say, well, maybe it's just a phase he's going through. And it gets worse, and it continues, and it graduates into drug use, which it didn't have to do. Because if it's serious enough, folks, what do? Barney will tell you. You nip it in the bud. You get it before it becomes worse, before it becomes ingrained in a habit of life. As it says in Proverbs, discipline your son while there's still time. In other words, before he dies or kills somebody else. What's that? That's David looking at a gal taking a bath, splish splash, on a Saturday night. So, it's not his wife, it's somebody else's wife. And David ends up getting her pregnant. And David wants to cover that up, so he invites her husband back from the battlefield, hoping he'll sleep with his wife. And when the baby's born, while he's out at battle, he comes back and says, wow, I'm glad David brought me back for a little rest and relaxation. But this guy's more honorable than David, and he says, ain't doing it. The rest of my fellow troopers out there don't get to come home and lie with their wives, so I'm not going to do it either. So David concocts a plan to get Uriah killed. And Joab, because David failed to nip it in the bud, David's general Joab, his nephew, is more than eager to participate in this murder. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront in the hardest fighting area, and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew that there were valiant men on the other side. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was slain also. So Joab is eager to participate in this murder, furthering David's sin. Time goes by, and David's son Absalom, who had a lot of hair, decides that he's going to take the throne away from David, his father. So David is running around the countryside, avoiding Absalom. Anyway, the two sides get into a battle, and David's troops win over Absalom's troops. But as he's riding through the forest, his hair gets caught in a branch. And David loves his son Absalom. Even though Absalom has stolen the throne away from David, David still doesn't want any harm to come to him. And then along came Joab. A certain man told Joab, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. And Joab said to the man who told him, "What? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him to the ground? I would have been glad to have given you 10 pieces of silver and a girdle." But Joab, I don't wear a girdle. But the man said to Joab, "Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not put my hand out against the king's son. For in your hearing and my hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom." And Joab says, "I don't have time for this. I'm not going to waste my time with you." And he took 3 darts in his hand, and he thrust them into the heart of Absalom. And while he was still alive in the oak, 10 young men from Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, and they struck him down, and they killed him. David could have avoided this had he nipped it in the bud. And as soon as Joab started his nasty business, taking care of it back then. So now David says, I've got to replace Joab. Why doesn't he put him to death? Oh, he's family. David said, "Say to Amasa." Amasa is a soldier from Judah. "Are you not my bone and flesh? God do so to me, and more also, if you are not commander of my army, henceforth in place of Joab." Joab was wearing a soldier's garment, and over it was a girdle, with a sword in its sheath fastened upon his loins, and as he went forward it fell out. And Joab said to Amasa, "Is it well with you, my brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard, and with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa did not observe the sword that was in Joab's hand, so Joab struck him with it in the body, and out came his intestines on the ground, and without striking a second blow, Amasa died, because Joab did not want to be replaced as a general, and he murdered an innocent man. Somebody else dies because David failed to nip it in the bud. So David's on his deathbed, and David had received from the Lord, "Solomon, your son, will be king in your place." But David's 4th son, Adonijah, had gathered for himself a chariot and 50 men to run in front of him. And this is what people do when they're saying, "I'm going to be the next king." Absalom did the same thing before he stole it from his father David. And David never said a thing to Adonijah. "No, you're not going to be king. Solomon is going to be the next king." So David's on his deathbed there, and who comes in but Bathsheba, and said, "King, didn't you promise that our son Solomon is going to be seated on the throne?" "Yep, I did." Now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, David had an old hag for a wife, Haggith, exalted himself, saying, "I will be king." And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. And his father had never any time displeased him by saying, why are you doing this?" He was also a very handsome man, and he was born next after Absalom. He conspired with Joab. Oh, here we go again. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and with Abiathar the priest. Oh boy, now we got the high priest involved. And they followed Adonijah, and they helped him out with this plan to become the next king. Well, Solomon is crowned king anyway, and just before David dies, he charges Solomon, saying, "Moreover, you also know what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, your cousin, did to me. How he dealt with the 2 commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner the son of Ner and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he murdered, avenging in the time of peace blood which had been shed in war, and putting innocent blood upon the girdle about my loins and upon the sandals of my feet. Act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. David refused to do what he should have done as the leader. And he passes this duty off to Solomon, his son. Well, at this time of Solomon's life, Solomon was a wise and very capable king. And so Joab flees to the tent of the Lord, and he catches a hold of the horns on the altar. Sanctuary! And when it was told King Solomon, Joab has fled to the tent of the Lord, and behold, he is beside the altar, Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, saying, go strike him down. So Joab eventually paid for it. But folks, as far as I'm concerned, it was 40 years too late. The Lord will bring back his bloody deeds upon his own head, because without the knowledge of my father David, he attacked and he slew with the sword 2 men more righteous and better than himself, Abner, the son of Ner, commander of the army of Israel, and Amasa, the son of Jether, commander of the army of Judah. And so shall their blood come back upon the head of Job and upon the head of his descendants forever. Folks, doing the right thing is not always easy. I can remember a fellow up in Center Point who was engaged to a girl, and it became increasingly obvious that this girl did not care for the Lord's will. She did not want to serve the Lord. And his friends sat him down and made him aware of all this. He was aware. He just didn't want to face it. He loved this girl very, very much. But his heart was into serving the Lord. And he started crying uncontrollably while they were counseling him. And he got up and he went out the door, went straight to her house, and broke up with her immediately. Because he sought first God's kingdom and his righteousness. Doing the right thing isn't always easy. You remember the son that I told you about? Had taken company vehicles when he was high and wrecked them. He was ruining other people's lives, getting them involved in alcoholism and drug use. Arrested time after time, always bailed out by his parents. His mother came to me, what should I do? I said, leave him in jail. He's my son, he might die. I said, lady, if you had grown up in Israel and you had a son that was like this, you know what your duty should have been? Your duty should have been you take him to the elders of the city and they stone him to death. You are not doing yourself, you are not doing us, and you're not doing your son any favors by not nipping this in the bud. You know he's dead. He's dead. Doing the right thing isn't always easy. Failure to do the right thing affects others. Think of all the innocent lives that were lost because David refused to nip Joab's tendencies in the bud. Friends, let's seek first God's kingdom. Why did God let Joab live so long and get away with this? Peter tells us that God is patient toward us. And never confuse that for approval. He was giving Joab time to repent. And Joab did not take advantage of that because, folks, it's the kind of God that we have. No matter how bad we have messed up, if God gives us time to say, I did wrong, it gets better, folks. It gets better for us, and it gets better for the people around us that we love. Seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all this other stuff will be yours as well.